Alaska Native culture and impacts of substance abuse. The very essence that makes Alaska great in the Alaska Native culture that has enriched this state since the beginning of time. There are 229 federally recognized tribes throughout Alaska, and prior to the settlement of Westerners in Alaska, there were no tribal councils or Alaska Native corporations because they were the only people populating Alaska in the mid 1800s. Russian explorers began to seep into Alaska and into Alaska Native villages, which, according to the article of Subjection and Sovereignty, Alaska Native corporations and the tribal governments in the 21st century by Thomas Michael Swenson, 2015, led to the United States purchasing Alaska from Russia in 1867. As mentioned by Morgan and Freeman in 2009, the Russian settlers and English traders not only brought their values to Alaska Native land, but they brought with them diseases that Alaska Natives had never been exposed to, which led to the entire village becoming ill and dying from epidemics of smallpox and virulent diseases. In this purchase of Alaska, the indigenous rights occupancy was created to respond into separate land and deciding which tribes may live where and which land was to be taken over with Western laws and values. Despite Alaska Native tribes standing their ground and demanding their own equal rights, as the United States government promised them when the original purchase took place in 1867, they never signed any official treaties with the Alaska Native people, and the government did little to protect the Alaska Native villages from being overran. Villages were outnumbered, and white men began to take over the land, as well as implement their Western values into these communities. As with any culture, it can be devastating as well as traumatizing to have new settlers move in and slowly overrun villages. This was their attempt to stamp out the Alaska Natives' culture, their family values, their language, and their ways of life. Missionaries that came into the villages starting in the 1870s were the first who began civilizing the Alaska Native populations, which led to discouraging the Alaska Native people to continue celebrating, living, and teaching the only culture and ways of life that they had ever known. The missionaries demonstrated that they did not see the Alaska Native people as civilized, and their traditions, ways held no value. This led to the missionaries functioning or forcing the Alaska Native people to abandon their languages, and even removing children from their families' homes. These sent the children to the Christian boarding schools, aiming to reform all Alaska Natives, all adults and children, into English-speaking Christian Alaska Natives. To ensure that children were not being influenced by outside sources, they often cut contact between children and their families, which, as one can imagine, is very traumatizing for young children as well as for their families, who had no way of contacting their children once they were sent away. Most of these children had literally been kidnapped and were sent away forcibly, following punishments and great degree of negative consequences if caught speaking their own language or participating in their own traditional medicines and ways of their ancestors. Therefore, during these years, the boarding school, when children aged out and graduated, they were sent back to their families. But they were deprived of crucial years that they otherwise would have been learning their ways of their people, such as language, substance, lifestyles, their family morals, traditions, so many sacred ceremonies and values that they had been with the Alaska Natives for thousands of years prior. Morgan, Robert, and Freeman referred to this being the beginning of the process of deculturization. That has laid the foundation for many social, physiological, and psychological ills that still plague Alaska Native people today. Many adults never got the opportunity to learn their Alaska languages. Many elders have passed on and were never able to pass on their tradition to their younger generations due to the long period of decades of trying to genocide the Alaska Native culture altogether and banishment of their own human rights. Even decades and decades later, one still can see the damages caused by the separation of Alaska Native people and their traditional ways. And it's not uncommon to speak Alaska Native leader today who can still remember these hard times for their people. As mentioned earlier, when Westerners brought in their ways into Alaska Native villages, they brought diseases and other ailments that were unfamiliar to the Alaska Native people. An example of additional Western ways that was seen as civilized and due to times were not regulated but still used amongst the Russian and English settlers were substances such as alcohol and other substances. According to Dickerson, American Indians and Alaska Native have the highest rates of alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, hallucinogens, and methamphetamine disorders in comparison with other races. The consequences of the substance use has been devastating, also reflecting in the correlation of alcohol use and suicide in the population of Alaska Natives. Other negative factors associated with this high rate of substance use is health risks. Discussed how risk and protective factors have played into this huge epidemic of alcoholism and substance use among the Alaska Native people. Some risk factors include childhood physical and sexual abuse, such as well as historical trauma and ongoing oppression of the Alaska Native people. It is noted in this article that the protective factors for assisting reduction of substance use amongst the Alaska Native culture seems to have been neglected and subject still lacks in knowledge today. There is also a connection between Alaska Natives who drink heavily and their family's bloodline of generations of drinking heavily. Many call it a cycle. In speaking with many Alaska Native adults, they can and will share about the drinking they witnessed as they grew up. From aunts to uncles, cousins, and siblings, many will tell you what begun drinking at a young age, most likely with their family members. These same adults that may be struggling with their substance use now are raising their own children and often drinking alcohol or using substance with or in front of them, or so forth. Some would say that this is still the case. A divide was created between ethnicities in Alaska. When Russian settlers and missionaries arrived in Alaska, labeling half villages that were made contact with the uncivilized and attempting, if not almost succeeding, to break their people, strip them of their traditions and languages, and demolish their culture altogether. It is not uncommon to hear Alaska Natives speak of this distrust about the white man, or to hear a Caucasian person refer negatively to the huge numbers of Alaska Natives who are homeless, incarcerated, and often drunk or strung out on the side of the city streets. The racism alone has developed from historical trauma between the white man and Alaska Natives, if so another cycle, one that creates a divide in the great state. For those who are the Alaska Native, it may be hard to understand how these historical traumas have greatly impacted the Alaska Native people, but it is demonstrated when speaking to most Alaska Native adults who range from their 20s to their 50s. Many of them report that they do not know their own native tongue, and many are unable to live a subsistence lifestyle due to lack of training. This divide is also recognized when individuals of authority, such as police officers, go out to villages they are not welcomed, and as without knowledge of history may assume they would be. In fact, few police officers have died going out to the villages on police calls. Despite the trauma tribulations that may have taken place in these families out of the remote villages, they still band together. Croft, Ackerman, and Spencer just discuss the various studies that have been done to reflect these strong cultural identity and feelings of belonging have reduced the risk of likelihood of substance use and depression in their lifetime. On the other side, those who experience alienation from their culture tradition experience an increase of risk of substance abuse, depression, cognitive disorders, and suicide attempts. Many studies reflect an associated legacy of historical trauma, continued traumatic stress, perceptions of discrimination, and sense of disconnect between Alaska Native families, including cultural and spiritual loss, with this continued struggle of substance use in Alaska Native communities. What will help the problem? There are nearly 100 villages and communities across Alaska who have been banned the sale, importation, and possession of alcohol in the communities. As with many policies or laws, this does not always prevent the alcohol from making its way to the village, but has helped to reduce the amount of villages that are being hindered by this plague. Other studies have examined biological factors outside of trauma, mental health, or even social factors for substance use, as mentioned by Whitesell in an article discussing risk protection and prevention of substance use among American Indians and Alaska Natives, possible genetic factors associated with different risk factor for alcohol and substance use amongst this population. Further research is being conducted to examine the genetic pathways, abuse, and dependence. There are many various factors that have been discussed, such as weather, demographics, as well as mental health factors. Despite the various studies that have been concluded, examining Alaska Native struggles with substance use and searching for ways to assist in healing the broken communities. One thing remains the same, which is the common knowledge that having identity, purpose, and can be a positive protective factor to assist in making change in our Alaska Native communities for younger generations to come. The Alaska Native people stand strong together and have grown stronger as a whole across the state to fight and preserve their dying cultures and to eliminate the substance use that has plagued their communities and threatened to take what is left of their legacies.